We often think of modern warfare in terms of overwhelming technological superiority. We see visions of GPS-guided munitions, soldiers equipped with advanced night vision, and an entire ecosystem of high-tech digital gear designed to dominate the battlefield. But what if the soldiers of World War II, fighting through the brutal, soul-crushing rain and snow of the European winter of 1944, possessed a different kind of superiority? What if they understood and mastered survival tricks that modern soldiers and even dedicated survivalists have completely, tragically overlooked? These men fought without the benefit of Gore-Tex jackets to shed the relentless water, without the simple certainty of a disposable lighter, and certainly without the godlike guidance of a GPS satellite. In the face of this profound adversity, they didn't just endure. They innovated. They developed entire systems of survival, ingenious methods born from battlefield necessity that kept them from freezing to death in the absolute harshest conditions imaginable on this earth. These weren't just tricks. They were a testament to human resilience, a deep, practical knowledge forged in the crucible of combat. In this video, you are going to discover 7 of these forgotten World War II fire methods, techniques that have been almost entirely lost to the passage of time. These are skills so profoundly effective, so deeply rooted in the fundamental principles of fire and physics, that they could still save your life today, in any wilderness, in any weather. And if you stay with us until the end, we will uncover a surprising and powerful truth, that these soldiers, in their desperate struggle for warmth, may have understood something fundamental about resilience and ingenuity that our modern gear-dependent world has almost completely, and perhaps dangerously, forgotten. Their legacy is more than just victory in war. It's a blueprint for survival against all odds, a lesson written in fire and ice. Number 1. The soldier's pocket kit. In a world before our modern culture of disposable convenience, a soldier on the front lines learned a critical lesson with shocking speed. Standard issue equipment was often just a fragile starting point, not a guaranteed solution. The flimsy paper matchbooks handed out to GIs were notoriously, almost comically, useless. They were frequently the very first casualty of a swift river crossing, or the slow, creeping dampness of a week spent shivering in a wet foxhole. But these soldiers refused to be victims of their inadequate gear. With lives on the line, they evolved. They developed something far more robust, far more reliable, and infinitely more personal than anything they were ever issued. They created their own personal, fully weatherproofed fire systems from the ground up, using nothing but battlefield debris and sheer ingenuity. This wasn't a single rigid method taught in a manual. It was a fluid and adaptable system, born from the unique combination of a soldier's individual creativity and the discarded scraps of his daily life. The foundation of this incredible kit was almost always a repurposed metal container, a small, sturdy tobacco tin, or an empty ration can, its previous contents long gone. To render it completely waterproof, soldiers would meticulously melt wax from a precious candle, or if that was unavailable, they'd smear thick boot grease, or even rendered animal fat into every single seam, creating a surprisingly effective and durable seal against the elements. But they didn't just carelessly toss their matches inside this protected space. No, they improved them, hardening them for the realities of war. Each individual match head was painstakingly dipped into melted wax, forming a waterproof shell. To bring one to life, a soldier would simply scrape the wax off the tip with a thumbnail, revealing the perfectly dry, ready-to-strike chemical core. The true genius of this personal system, however, was in the meticulously prepared tinder they carried within. Small strips of cloth, often torn from a worn-out uniform or a tattered sandbag, were rolled into tight, compact cylinders and then thoroughly soaked in hot wax. These wax-impregnated rolls were not only waterproof, but could hold a steady, consistent flame for several minutes, providing a crucial window of time long enough to ignite even damp or stubborn kindling. An even more ancient technique, char cloth, was rediscovered out of raw necessity by slowly cooking small squares of cotton cloth inside a sealed tin with a tiny pinhole, they created a remarkable material with an incredibly low ignition temperature. A single fleeting spark from a failing lighter or a piece of flint could make it catch and blossom into a glowing, persistent ember. This personal fire kit was a soldier's lifeline, a pocket-sized testament to human ingenuity. Number 2, stick manufacturing tinder from wet wood. Now, transport yourself in your mind to the relentless freezing rain of the Hurtgen Forest Campaign. A battle not just against the enemy, but against nature itself. In its most unforgiving state, every piece of wood on the forest floor, every branch, every twig, is utterly saturated with ice-cold water. The ground is a sea of mud and decay. In this environment, a standard fire seems like an impossible dream. This is precisely where a second forgotten skill becomes an absolute lifesaver. The profound ability to process a seemingly useless, soaking wet branch to expose its bone-dry core and, in the same process, create its own perfect tinder from scratch. The feather stick is a technique that has since become a celebrated staple of modern bushcraft and survival schools. But for a soldier shivering in a foxhole in World War II, it was a purely practical skill, a desperate art born of raw necessity. The underlying principle is simple, elegant physics. Water, especially on dense wood, does not and cannot instantly soak all the way to the core of a branch. There is a sanctuary of dry wood hidden within. By skillfully stripping away the slick, wet outer bark and the slimy cambium layer with a standard-issue K-bar knife or a bayonet, a soldier could reach the clean, pale, and critically dry heartwood inside. This was the raw material for salvation. The technique itself is a masterclass in patience and fine motor control, especially for numb, frozen fingers. Holding his knife at a very shallow, precise angle against the wood, the soldier would push the blade forward, shaving off a thin, delicate curl of wood, but stopping the cut just before the end to leave the shaving attached to the main stick. This is the single most critical part of the entire process. He would then repeat this action again and again, rotating the stick and working his way around its circumference until the branch was covered in dozens of these delicate, paper-thin curls, all clustered together like the petals of a bizarre, wooden flower. The result of this painstaking effort is an ingenious, all-in-one fire-starting tool. The incredibly fine, high surface area curls are the tinder, ready to catch the weakest flame, and the solid stick they are attached to is the kindling. Once a single match flame touches the almost transparent edge of a feather curl, the fire spreads with astonishing rapidity through the interconnected shavings, generating a concentrated burst of intense heat that is more than enough to ignite the solid wooden core. This was never just a clever trick. It was a profound testament to the core survivalist idea that the most valuable tool you can ever possess is not a piece of gear you carry, but a piece of knowledge you hold in your mind. Number 3, fire from munitions. For the infantrymen on the front line, there was one resource that was almost always available in quantity, even when dry matches and usable tinder were a distant, fading memory: his own ammunition. In the desperate life-or-death calculus of extreme survival, where the slow, creeping threat of hypothermia was often more immediate and terrifying than the enemy, this constant availability of munitions led to one of the most uniquely military and inherently dangerous fire-starting methods imaginable, using the powerful propellant from a standard-issue bullet. This was a technique you would never find printed in any official field manual. This was raw, unfiltered battlefield knowledge, a piece of forbidden wisdom passed quietly from a hardened veteran to a green rookie in the hushed, tense moments between firefights. The process was fraught with risk and began with the delicate disassembly of a live cartridge. The soldier had to carefully pry the metal bullet from its brass casing, using a knife or another tool with extreme caution to avoid accidentally striking the sensitive primer at the base of the cartridge. Once the bullet was successfully removed, the chemical propellant, either cordite, which looked like tiny brittle strands of spaghetti, or granular smokeless powder, could be carefully poured out into a small pile. These propellants are specifically engineered for one purpose: to burn with extreme rapidity and at an incredibly high temperature, creating the explosive force needed to fire a projectile. This violent combustion was now to be repurposed for warmth. A small pile of the dark powder or a few strands of the cordite would be placed inside a prepared tinder bundle of dry grass, cloth, or bark. A single, fleeting spark from a simple flint and steel was more than enough for instantaneous, violent ignition. Some soldiers even learned to weaponize the now empty cartridge case itself as a percussion fire starter. By placing the base on a hard surface and striking the primer with a rock or the butt of a rifle, it would produce a powerful, deafeningly loud, and incredibly hot flash, exactly like a giant cap gun. This flash was more than sufficient to ignite the waiting pile of propellant. It was loud, it was dangerous, and it always cost a precious round of ammunition. But on a freezing night when hypothermia was the more immediate and certain enemy, that sudden, brilliant flash of chemical fire was the most beautiful and welcome sight in the entire world. It was a direct, powerful conversion of the very tools of war into the fundamental tools of life. Number 4, the trench stove. In a combat zone, especially on a static front line, fire is a deeply paradoxical force. It is both a life-saving friend and a life-ending foe. Its gentle warmth can save your life from the crippling effects of exposure, but its telltale smoke and its revealing light can act as a beacon, drawing mortar fire or a sniper's bullet and ending your life in an instant. On the static, entrenched front lines of Europe, the desperate need for a small, highly efficient, and critically smokeless source of heat and light led to the independent invention and widespread adoption of one of the most common pieces of improvised gear of the entire war: the trench stove. This simple but brilliant device, sometimes known as an oil rag stove or a smudge pot, was born entirely of battlefield desperation, constructed from the literal trash of war. The principle behind it was brilliantly simple, relying on the ancient concept of a wick to control combustion. The body of the stove was fashioned from any available and appropriately sized metal container: an empty ration can, a discarded steel ammunition box, or even, in the most dire of emergencies, a soldier's own helmet. A small amount of any scavenged liquid fuel, be it gasoline, siphoned from a jeep, diesel, lubricating oil, or even hydraulic fluid, was poured into the bottom of the container to create a shallow reservoir. Then, a thick strip of cloth torn from a blanket, a coiled rag, or even a piece of rope was thoroughly soaked in the fuel and then carefully placed inside, with a small portion acting as the exposed wick. When lit, the fuel-saturated rag didn't erupt into a large, uncontrolled smoky flame as one might expect. Instead, it burned with a remarkably steady, intensely hot, and relatively smokeless blue flame that was naturally shielded from the wind by the walls of its container. The combustion was so surprisingly efficient that it produced significantly less smoke and odor than a conventional open wood fire, which was an absolutely critical advantage for avoiding detection by the enemy. This humble, self-contained little contraption could effectively heat a small, cramped dugout, melt snow for safe drinking water, or warm the notoriously unappetizing canned sea rations that GIs carried. This wasn't just about battlefield convenience, it was a form of practical alchemy, the magical transformation of the foul-smelling industrial byproducts and refuse of the war machine itself into life-saving, morale-boosting warmth. For modern survivalists who are often hyper-focused on wood-burning stoves, this forgotten piece of Depression-era knowledge offers a whole new dimension to survival heating, a complete, portable heating system that requires no natural fuel whatsoever, just a bit of scavenged liquid, some scrap metal, and a piece of knowledge that's been all but lost to history. Number 5, solar fire and the Icelands. Of all the myriad fire-starting methods rediscovered or invented during the war, none seems more miraculous, more like a magic trick than creating a powerful fire-starting beam of energy from the sun itself. But unlike a persistent and popular myth, you absolutely could not use the curved, polished bottom of a standard issue metal canteen to achieve this. The so-called canteen lens is a complete fiction, a survival falsehood that simply doesn't work. The reality of how soldiers harnessed the sun was far more resourceful and opportunistic. Soldiers on the battlefield would scavenge for lenses wherever they could find them, from the shattered eyepieces of broken binoculars, from a captured or discovered camera, or even from the thick, curved glass bottom of a discarded wine or beer bottle. The principle of a solar lens is wonderfully straightforward. A convex or magnifying lens gathers and focuses parallel rays of sunlight down to a single, tiny, intensely hot point. When this searing pinpoint of light was focused on a piece of dark, receptive material like black char cloth, this intense concentration of solar energy would cause it to begin smoking and then spontaneously form a glowing, self-sustaining ember within a matter of seconds. This method was completely silent, infinitely reusable as long as the sun was out, and most importantly, it conserved a soldier's precious and finite supply of matches for wet or overcast days. But what about on the frozen fronts, on those brutally cold days without direct, clear sunlight? This is where the truly forgotten and almost unbelievable part of this technique comes into play. A method that seems to completely defy all logic, using a piece of solid ice as a functional lens. The process was incredibly painstaking and required immense patience. A soldier would first need to find or cut a chunk of perfectly clear ice, completely free of fractures or trapped air bubbles that would distort the light. He would then have to carefully carve it into a rough, double convex lens shape with his knife. The final critical step was to use the gentle warmth of his own hands to slowly melt and polish the surfaces of the ice into a smooth, optically effective curve. On a day with a bright, hazy overcast, the sun's location in the sky is still visible as a bright spot. Using this carefully crafted ice lens, he could focus the diffuse sunlight onto his char cloth. It wasn't an instantaneous process like with a glass lens. It could take many long minutes of unwavering focus, holding his numb, shaking hands perfectly still. But eventually, if he persisted, a tiny wisp of pale smoke would appear, and a slow, creeping red ember would begin to form on the blackened cloth. It is a profound act of transformation, taking the very element that represents the life-threatening cold, the ice, and transforming it into a tool to create life-giving warmth. It is, without a doubt, one of the most remarkable and inspiring survival skills to ever emerge from the war. 6. The haybox cooker. One of the greatest logistical and tactical challenges on any battlefield wasn't just starting a fire, but safely and efficiently maintaining it. A traditional cooking fire requires a constant supply of fuel, which might be scarce, and it produces a continuous plume of smoke and a visible glow at night, both of which are an open invitation to the enemy. A forward position could be instantly compromised by the simple act of cooking a hot meal. The German army, in particular, facing resource shortages and fighting on multiple fronts, revived an old and brilliantly simple piece of civilian technology that perfectly solved this complex problem: the Kochkiste, which translates literally to cook box, known in English as the haybox cooker. This remarkable method is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all the techniques on our list because it allows you to cook food for hours after. The fire has been completely extinguished, using no additional energy whatsoever. The principle is nothing more than simple, highly effective thermal insulation. A cook working in a relatively safe rear area would bring a large lidded pot of stew, soup, or other rations to a full rolling boil over a conventional fire. As soon as it was thoroughly heated, the pot would be immediately removed from the fire and placed into a specially prepared, oversized wooden box that had been tightly packed with a thick layer of insulating material, typically hay or straw, but old blankets, newspapers, or even sawdust would work. More of this insulating material was then stuffed densely all around and on top of the pot, filling every possible air gap, and a heavy lid was latched shut, sealing the pot within its insulated cocoon. The tremendous amount of retained heat from the initial boiling, now unable to escape into the atmosphere, would continue to slow cook the food inside the pot for many hours. The advantages of the system were immense. Firstly, it was incredibly fuel efficient, requiring only enough fire and fuel for the initial, relatively brief boiling period. Secondly, and more importantly, it was completely stealthy. Once the pot was secured inside the box, there was no flame, no light, and absolutely no smoke to betray a position. The box could be loaded onto a truck or hand-carried to the front lines, arriving hours later with its contents still piping hot, providing a massive and desperately needed morale boost to frontline troops without ever incurring the extreme risk of a forward cooking fire. The haybox cooker represents a different but equally vital, kind of forgotten fire method. Not one of ignition, but one of harnessing, preserving, and controlling heat. It was a simple, non-technological solution to a complex tactical problem, proving that sometimes the most powerful survival tool is not fire itself, but the intelligent control of it. Number 7, the Dakota fire pit. All the methods we've explored so far are primarily designed for creating small, personal flames, enough to warm your hands, light a cigarette, or prepare a single ration. But what if a full squad of soldiers needed a larger, more substantial fire for shared warmth against the biting cold or for cooking a larger quantity of food? A conventional above-ground bonfire, no matter how well built, is an absolute beacon for the enemy. Its light can be seen for miles at night, and its smoke column is a clear signal during the day. To solve this critical tactical problem, soldiers on the European front adapted an ingenious and ancient fire design with deep roots in the ancestral knowledge of the indigenous peoples of the American Great Plains. The Dakota fire pit. It is, in essence, an underground fire that cleverly creates its own integrated bellows system, resulting in a hotter, cleaner, and virtually invisible burn. The process was simple enough for any soldier equipped with a standard entrenching tool. It involved digging 2 separate but connected holes. The first was a vertical chamber, roughly a foot wide and a foot deep, which would contain the actual fire itself. The second, and far more crucial part of the design, was a separate angled air supply tunnel dug about a foot away from the main pit, connecting to the absolute base of the first fire chamber. The physics are elegant and self-sustaining. When a fire is lit in the main vertical chamber, the rising column of superheated air and exhaust gas creates a powerful vacuum effect at the base of the fire. This vacuum, in turn, draws a constant, high-velocity flow of fresh oxygen through the angled supply tunnel, feeding it directly to the base of the burning fuel. The result is an incredibly efficient fire that burns extremely hot but produces very little visible smoke because the fuel is being consumed so completely. Furthermore, all the flames are contained entirely below ground level, making them completely invisible from the side, even from just a few feet away. In windy conditions that would scatter and potentially extinguish a normal surface fire, the Dakota pit actually works better, as the wind blowing across the surface forces even more oxygen into the air supply tunnel, intensifying the combustion. After use, the 2 holes could be quickly and easily filled back in with the excavated dirt, and the topsoil replaced, leaving almost no trace that a fire had ever been there. It's a perfect and powerful example of modern soldiers adapting ancient, time-tested knowledge to the unique challenges of the industrial battlefield, turning the very earth itself into a sophisticated tool for concealment and survival. We often look back at the soldiers of World War II with a deep and abiding sense of reverence, primarily for their incredible courage and their profound sacrifice. But after exploring these 7 forgotten fire techniques, perhaps we should be asking ourselves a different, more introspective question. Who is truly more vulnerable in a crisis? Is it them, the soldiers of the past who fought with primitive tools? Or is it us, the inhabitants of this modern, technologically saturated world? They didn't just survive in spite of their severe material limitations, they thrived because of their ingenuity. They developed sophisticated, adaptable systems that worked in harmony with available materials and the fundamental processes of nature. They learned, through sheer necessity, to see the world not as a collection of disposable products, but as a rich tapestry of resources. In their eyes, a discarded tin can wasn't trash, but the body of a potential stove. A soaking wet branch wasn't useless deadfall, but a hidden source of perfectly dry tinder. A bullet wasn't just an instrument of death, but a potential spark of life-giving fire. Today, we have traded that deep, hands-on resilience for push-button convenience. We have overwhelmingly exchanged hard-won, practical knowledge for easily accessible but shallow information. And in making that trade, we may have become far more fragile, more brittle, and more vulnerable than our ancestors in ways we rarely, if ever, stop to acknowledge. The most powerful World War II survival technique wasn't any single skill, like building a Dakota pit or making a feather stick. It was their holistic, integrated approach to the problem of survival itself. Nothing was ever wasted. Every object had a secondary purpose. Systems worked together in concert, creating a layered defense against the cold. So the ultimate question isn't whether these incredible World War II techniques still work today. Of course they do. Their effectiveness is rooted in physics and chemistry, which are timeless. The real question is whether we, as a society, are humble enough to learn from those we might mistakenly view as technologically less advanced. Because in a world of ever-increasing uncertainty, resource scarcity, and fragile supply chains, the most dangerous thing of all might just be our own modern arrogance. The quiet, unexamined belief that we've somehow outgrown the fundamental wisdom of those who thrived without any of the complex systems upon which we now so utterly depend. Their knowledge was hard-won on the front lines of history, and that, in itself, might be the most important survival lesson of all.